Deepak's essay reads like, listen, you may all be getting very excited about digital, but let me give you a reality check. These are the number of people who actually have a phone. These are the number of people who know how to use it. This is the variation in terms of gender. This is the number of people who can access X or Y and so on. So and you've used the phrase rebooting and retooling. Deepak, can you tell us what this rebooting and retooling looks like? Elaborate on the concept, perhaps.
Thanks, Dushyant. So I think before we get into that retooling and rebooting, I think first let's understand the concept of digital itself in a slightly different manner. Normally, when we talk about digital, we talk about zeros and ones. It's a binary situation. It's either here or there. But the reality of even digital is that it's an analogous journey. Okay. So even in the digital scenario, you have a range and you have a spectrum of things that you can do, you cannot do. Yeah. So let's say 20 years back, the type of access that we used to have, even on a 2G network, that seemed to be at times fantastic. And at times, even on 4G today, we find it quite pathetic in terms of the speed, although it is in terms of sheer volume, if I look at, it's a very high speed compared to that. I mean, today, the type of connection that you and I are using right now is actually thousands times faster than the total international bandwidth which was available in the country on 15th of August 1995 when the internet services started in this country. Okay, thousands times more. Each of us is using this. Now, the type of communication that we are doing this, let's say on this Zoom call or so many.
The total across the country available to thousands of people and organizations and.
Yes.
Wow, okay. That's quite a statistic.
It was only 64 kbps, by the way. 64 kilobits per second in 1995 only. And that too, it was via satellite. Anyway. And today we are, many of us having more than 100 Mbps connections at our homes. Okay.
But my internet connection claims it's 1 GB per second. That's what it says, at least.
Okay. So
that's what it says. I haven't checked.
Okay. So the other thing is, when we are looking at this whole thing around digital, one is that yes, those who have the devices, those who have the affordability, so those who can afford the services, and those who actually have the connection also and have an ability to use the service. So there are people who may have a device, there are people who may afford it, there are people who might still be in a catchment area of a good signal, but doesn't mean that automatically they know how to use these things. In fact, many of us, I know that a lot of people had to sort of learn about how to get on the Zoom call or any such WebEx or anything like that. Google Meets, Microsoft Teams, etc. But apart from that, there are two other things that I just want to quickly comment on. So what you talked to Durga as well as to Mani. So to Durga, Osama did ask about the gig workers. Now on the gig workers, if you see, I think there are two very important aspects of that gig workers that we all need to think about as a society is, one is around algorithmic discrimination, potentially. Okay, so it could be, so for example, if there's a driver who is doing very well, that person gets more rating, that person gets much more business. Somebody who has got slightly lower ratings does not get that much of business, and slowly the inequities may increase too much. Okay, so that spread keeps on going. Second thing, Mani just mentioned, and the second thing related to gig workers is about the safety net. So around the world, it is being thought that in some form, maybe through co-contributions, etc., some sort of safety net is needed for these gig workers. Now, Mani did mention about sexual harassment at workplace, but it's not just about sexual harassment at workplace. There's also issues around domestic violence, for example. And one of the big challenges in our country, although it's true globally also, but it is more accentuated in a country like ours, when women have less access and ownership of the devices, even in the families. That means increasingly, or a lot of those people, including those who are depending, doing some sort of work, might be sharing it with some other family members, or they might be using a device which actually is owned by somebody else in the family. Now, in those situations, the type of situation that Mani just mentioned a few minutes back, in terms of the workplace harassment, can also should also be seen both in conjunction with the potential of domestic violence, but also in some cases, what will happen is just because somebody is getting sexual harassment or under workplace in even in the digital space could also have ramifications in terms of being reflected in terms of additional sexual or otherwise domestic violence even at home. So I think there could be also a double whammy even in this type of scenario. Now, when we are looking at in terms of the digital space, I think what we need to look at is how do we increase the digital access itself? So how do we make the not just the devices, but also the services affordable? So if we see what the government has been doing since 2002, the Universal Service Fund, is to fund the infrastructure. So the government says, okay, build a tower, put up this, put up that, and then the hope is that the people will start using the service. And that's why today we have a scenario that whole lot of people are in a catchment area of even a 4G signal of a reasonably good strength, of a reasonably low tariff, but still they do not have the device, they do not have a smartphone, or even if they own a smartphone, they cannot afford those rates. So I think what one of the important things is that the government needs to look at is about subsidizing not only the infrastructure, which is the supply side, but also the demand side, enablement in terms of devices and services. And this is something which could be easily be done through DBT type of mode. So that's one area. And of course, there are other areas also related to improving our infrastructure, because the infrastructure, the way we are using this, for example, in terms of work from home, people are streaming. So right now, for example, at my home, I'm using this on Zoom call, but there are also others in the family who might be watching streaming video, or somebody else might be doing online education. So there are those aspects also we need to be mindful of.
So I'll just read out a few statistics from your essay, Deepak. Uh, uh, but before that, Mani, do you want to respond to? I think you did mention Mani. Can you unmute your? Yeah, you did mention domestic violence. Do you want to say anything about what Deepak just said?
Right. See, certainly, like, now the government needs to identify these problems, and first of all, identify that this is happening, and then acknowledge and figure out how to deal with these problems. Now, certainly there has been a spike in domestic violence. There are various reports which say, interestingly, I don't know if you've seen this report. In fact, it says sexual harassment at workplace has reduced in the financial year, in the first quarter of the financial year, which I find bizarre, because now more and more companies are saying we've raised all this awareness. However, what has actually happened is women are not complaining, right? Even with domestic violence, the numbers went down at some point because women could not find help. And so there is that infrastructure does not exist. And as Mr. Maheshwari rightly pointed out, we need to create that infrastructure.
Right. So and now I just go through some a few statistics that Deepak has cited in his essay. So and they're quite fascinating. And so he cites TRAI, Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, 2019 report, which says rural tele density is 56% compared to urban at 156%. Gender inequality is he writes, is also quite sharp, with women accounting for just 35% of all internet users in the country. I was quite shocked to read this. I did not think, I mean, I live under a rock and I'm a fool and I have my privilege, but I did not think the disparity would be so stark. Another statistic he cites is that he says the participation of women as users is slightly better yet unsatisfactory in urban areas at 40%. So among the urban versus rural, in urban areas women are 40%, whereas in rural it's 31%. So a lot of people may like to believe that maybe urban will be the double of or triple of rural, but clearly there is not much difference. And Deepak, you spoken of. I mean, it's quite intriguing. You spoken of demand side subsidizing. How would such a subsidy work? I
Okay,
mean, how do you in practice, how do you do this?
so it's just like DBT, just like Manrega, all these type of things. So what we are doing is we are basically making payments directly to beneficiaries. Okay, similar type of thing can be done here also. So you have, let's say, the family income data. You have a whole lot of data. So there's different ways of slicing and dicing these type of metrics, and you could also do in this scenario, I would say, even a calibrated level of subsidy. So you need not give the same level of subsidy to everybody in the same level. So for example, if you have children who are studying, etc., you may like to give them more of a, let's say, a data coupon. Okay, coupon or something like that. This is a food voucher or something like that. In this case, it could be a data coupon, for example. Okay, and give the choice to them. So, for example, if the government says that, okay, we are giving you 100 rupees or let's say so many GB of data. Now, so many GB of data, I should have the freedom as a beneficiary to utilize on A service provider or B service provider, or maybe in this month A and the next month on B. And that's something where the service provider will also vie between and amongst themselves to provide better services. Because right now, the way it is happening, it is basically subsidizing the infrastructure. So the Universal Service Fund is a corpus which the government has collected since 2002 onwards, where this part of the service providers' revenue goes there. And then again, it is the service providers who bid for those projects in what is known as financially non-feasible areas. And then one of them gets the subsidy to build an infrastructure. And they go ahead and build the infrastructure. But just because you build, it doesn't mean that they will come. So you also need to build, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that they'll be able to afford those devices. It doesn't mean that they'll start using the services on their own. Yes, there have been experiments that some people have started doing stuff on their own, but there are also other scenarios where people do need some hand-holding support.
So, Deepak,
Dushit,
you sorry, no, please, yes.
so Dushit, I just want to make a comment and ask Deepak a question as well. So, Deepak, so whether you look at news or you look at commerce, right, for the last decade and all the stuff that I've seen, there's always been, 60-65% male, 30-35%. You've always seen this unequal internet, right? And I've seen this over and over and over again, right? And I've tried to think a lot about how do you solve for these entry points, right? And then you have the whole commerce and OTT explosion, right? Where we said commerce, obviously it's those with purchasing power. That means again, women are at a disadvantage. And then with OTT, every time I'm on such a panel and people say, oh, but why don't women come and use data? And often my answer is because they are just doing far more important things than watching some nonsense, right? They're trying to figure out things for their kids, for their livelihoods. Oftentimes it's the definition of work and the free time that you have. So when you line these three things up, right? And now when I'm again sitting on this phenomenal surge of news, right? And we are seeing a lot of first-time users, whether it's into English news or vernacular news, come in because of COVID. Again, there is a certain opportunity, right, that all of us have purely because of information and digitization, right, of basic utility. How would you, if you had to redefine two very critical entry points, right, which is a combination of access and perhaps utility and perhaps interest, any thoughts on what those one or two opportunities or entry points could be?
So, Durga, that's a very interesting question. Now, first of all, I would say that this, although yes, on one hand, we do have this inequity, and this has been around for quite some time, but I must add that this inequity has actually come down over the years. So let's say, I mean, I've been involved in the internet industry ever since it started, or in fact, even before that. So at that point of time, there were very few women users, and for two different reasons. Number one, the female participation in the formal workforce at that point of time was extremely low. That's one important reason. And second thing is, in terms of economic independence, also it was extremely low at that point of time. Okay, over these years it has been changing, but even today, as we said earlier, these inequities still exist. And by the way, these inequities exist not only in India, in many other parts of the world, but in India, I would say it's still pretty high. Now, second thing is in terms of what are the 2 or 3 major things that one could do. So one is, if women have their own devices, and I think this is not just about having ownership of that particular device. I think this is also a level of personalization in terms of privacy, in terms of having their own say in how and when they want to use it. So that's one very important area. For example, a few years back when I used to work in a startup called Microsoft, we did a project in some villages on sending text messages to prenatal and postnatal vaccinations. And in many cases, the failure was only because of one reason, because the device was owned by the male member in the family. And although we did work out the messages in the local languages, it just did not reach the recipient there. And second thing is, we also have, especially I would say this is a concern more in rural areas than in urban areas, is about the social I'll say concerns by whether it is a Thap Panchayat or anybody like that, or somebody else with a diktat, that girls and women should not use a mobile device. Okay, so even if there's an affordability, even if they know how to use it, there are other social pressures. So what we are seeing even in the digital space, so whether it is about the what Mani was mentioning earlier and many other areas, these things are being reflected even in the digital space, what we are seeing in the society in general. So for example, Dushyant, I just want to tell you something. I mean, right now, this whole work from home phrase has been around, has become quite a craze for past few months, yes. But I had talked about work from home, a regulatory framework, allowing work from home way back in October 2004.
Wow.
Okay, so yeah, so it was published in that sense. I talked about e-commerce regulatory framework in 1998-99. Although the government did come out with a draft policy last year in February, okay, still there's no formal policy. But the fact is that many of these things do take a lot of time to develop and foster.